Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 195, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/195. You can also find the show at the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick. And today I'm really glad to be joined by Scott Horton. He's the director of the Libertarian Institute, among other things, and Kyle Anzalone. So really glad to get you guys on the same show. How's it going?
Doing great.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pat.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so one thing that I haven't covered a whole lot on the show here is Yemen, and it's a topic that's really incredibly important right now. And I think that, Kyle, in your first appearance on the show back in episode 41, we talked a little bit about it, but I haven't really touched it since then. And I've just, in scanning the pages on antiwar.com, I just see airstrike after airstrike and scores dead. So do you just want to start us off and tell us what's been going on?
Sure. Yeah. So, if anybody listened to episode 41, there's probably surprisingly little that's changed for 4 or 5 years that's happened in a war, as far as at least the lines on the ground. Now, there's been, some political stuff that's happened, but yeah, if you're talking about Yemen, the main fighting going on right now is in Marib, which is central Yemen. And one of the reasons this particular city is of importance is because I believe it's one of the last main cities that's not held by the Houthis that is traditionally North Yemen. And also it's considered something of a resource-richer area of Yemen, I guess, compared to the rest of it. Although I've read some that there's a little bit of an overestimate. People are like, oh, this is a resource-rich area, and make it out to be more than it is. I don't think any area of Yemen is particularly lucrative in resources, especially with all the instability and everything like that. But you also have fighting going on in and around Hodeidah still, which is the main port city. And the most important thing about Yemen is that it's being blockaded. The airports and the ports, particularly in the north of the country where 80% of the people live under Houthi control, is isolated from the rest of the world. Maybe they could get a ship into the port every now and then, but even then, all the infrastructure at the port has been destroyed, so it takes them a lot longer to unload the ships. It's a lot more difficult to unload them. And you just waste medical supplies and all kinds of food and everything on the docks as they're either going through this absurd Saudi inspection regime where they constantly made ships go up and down the coast of the Red Sea to different Saudi ports and then send them back. And the situation really isn't even better in the southern area of Yemen, which is ostensibly controlled by the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. And even there, it takes them a long time to get food and grain into the port in the city there in Aden. So, I think the main problem is the blockades, really. There's still fighting going on. The bombing is still a problem. The Houthis have even said that, 15,000 of their fighters have died since mid-June. That's a striking admission from a militant group to say that many their fighters had died in airstrikes. And so, that just goes to show how heavy the Saudi bombing campaign is of Yemen right now. But it's not changing, who controls what city at this point, at least.
Yeah, and to me it seemed like who on the ground are the Houthis fighting? Because it seems to me like the main, the only thing really keeping them at bay is the Saudi bombing campaign.
Yeah, that's a great point. They have a variety of fighters, against them. The UAE backs the Southern Transitional Council, which is kind of, but not always, aligned with the Saudi-backed government, which is a coalition of mercenaries, some from Sudan. There's some, small fractions of the former Yemeni government military that still fights with them. Other, Yemenis that are willing to just fight for a paycheck and whatever. But also you have the jihadist forces in Yemen, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who also align themselves with the Saudi and UAE side against the Houthis.
Yeah, what people need to understand, first of all, is it's been 7 years of this. And I think, Kyle said it all when he said, look, if you go back and listen to that interview from however many years ago, it's the same thing still. In other words, there's been no progress by the American-led coalition. They always call it the Saudi-led coalition, but we're the superpower and they're the client state. So it's more like, a classical empire situation where the satellite, has the burden of fighting the war for the core empire. which is opposite of like America fighting Israel's war in Iraq, for example. But anyway, this group, the Houthis, have not ruled Yemen for a very long time. I don't know when the last time was, at least decades ago, maybe more than that. And, to make a long story short, they came out of the north in 2014, in the end of 2014, the beginning of 2015, consolidated power over the capital city, which was the motive for the start of the war by the Saudis. And they did that as a consequence of the war on terrorism and the CIA drone war that the Obama government had inaugurated there in 2009. And so, you can read it all in enough already, the step-by-step there, how it all, took place. But essentially, the drone war against al-Qaeda led to, some political maneuvering that ended up as a consequence, this group of Shiites from the north coming and taking over the capital city. At that time, the generals, including our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who was at that time a 4-star general, the commander of Central Command, their idea was they don't really have a problem with the Houthis. The Houthis like killing al-Qaeda guys. So we'll just use them for that. The al-Qaeda guys sure want them dead and consider them to be, heretics and all of this stuff. So they're natural allies of ours. And so they were providing intelligence to the Houthis to use to target and kill al-Qaeda. And that was as late as January and, presumably into February and March of 2015. That was ongoing until in March 2015, almost 7 years ago now, Barack Obama switched sides in the war and took Saudi, UAE, and as Kyle was just saying, al-Qaeda's side against their enemies, the Houthis, who've never done anything to us at all. And then on top of that, they're fighting this brutal war, this completely, illegal kind of medieval siege campaign, completely, contrary to the Geneva Conventions and all the laws of war under the United Nations Charter and American law. But it's all deniable. It's all leading from behind. It's the Saudi-led coalition. Yeah, Saudi and UAE, sometimes their tactics are bad, except that they're shooting American guns and flying American planes, dropping American bombs, and they got American officials and mercenaries and military officers and spies and whoever taking care of all their logistics and their targeting and their intelligence and all the maintenance and care and feeding of their planes. And so, we could turn off their war. America, okay, let's say that Biden, first of all, if Biden just called Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and said, enough, that's it, war's over, that's probably all it would take right there. If he said it and it sounded like he really meant it. But let's say that the Saudis said, well, we're going to continue the war without you then. Well, the Americans could end all support for the war and it would grind to a halt. Those F-15s don't maintain themselves and the Saudi princelings don't maintain them either. And the same thing for the British Tornadoes. That's BAE Systems and Boeing have to keep all these things in tip-top condition to keep the war going. So I don't think anyone questions that if Biden called the Prime Minister of Britain and the President of France and said, we are ending all support, they would be on board for whatever America said there if they insisted. No question about that. And the Saudis too, for that matter. But just hypothetically, we could just deprive them of all the support they need to wage the war, and they would have to bring it to a close. And the reason that they're this is also because it's a deniable leading from behind situation. They let the Saudis essentially plot the entire course of the war. And so from the very beginning, they have deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure to the nth degree, including bombing apartment buildings, bombing marketplaces, bombing car dealerships, bombing the potato chip factory, and then, of course, the litany, the hospitals, the water, the electricity, the sewage, the farms, the horses in their stables, the fishermen's boats, everything they can to reduce these people to starvation. And this is a country that's the poorest country in the Middle East. If you don't count Somalia, which we've been destroying for 20 years, now this month marking America's longest war, not Afghanistan, Somalia. But if you don't count them in the Horn of Africa, then Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East. Kyle was saying they do have some oil resources there in Marib, but they're not very well developed. And, the government has always, squandered the money for themselves and not built the country up. And I learned from Martha Mundy from the London School of Economics about how the IMF and the World Bank had previously screwed the Yemenis out of growing their millet and other grains and their sorghum and whatever sustenance crops. And instead told them, you guys should be growing coffee and cotton for export. And then you'll take the money and then you'll be eating Brazilian steaks and eating Florida oranges and all of this stuff, which is fine in a globalized economy, is great until America declares war on you and our Navy puts you under blockade and, pull our Star Destroyers into your orbit. Now what the hell are you going to do? And the answer is go hungry. And all of the aid organizations, and because, look, I've just been doing this for a long time in a row is all, from 2015 on, from the very beginning that spring, said this is going to be an absolute catastrophe. People are going to absolutely be starving to death. The population is 80 to 90% dependent on foreign imports of food at this point. And so it's been, an incredible, a terrible attempted adjustment for the population there, banned from all international trade and having to be forced to try to go back to growing their own sustenance crops in the middle also of a blockade and with all of their other infrastructure destroyed and their bombs and, their farms being bombed, including their grain silos and everything else. And so, the official number of dead in violence and indirect causes from the war as of now, 3.5 years ago was 250,000. And I'm sorry, Kyle, update me because they did update the number. The UN did update the number recently.
Yeah, they said
it was only to 500,000 or something, right?
No, they said 377,000 by the end of this year.
Oh, okay.
And
which is that's bullshit because that means that only 50,000 have died in the last 3 years since 2018, since this time 2018, which is, in fact, I think even the spring of 2018 was when that number came out. So that's absolute nonsense. In other words, and the UN, I interviewed the guy from the UN, McGoldrick, I think it was, who he was the guy that they quoted for years and years and years and years saying that 10,000 had died. Like, well, if 10,000 had died in 1 year, then how come 5 years into the war, you're still saying only 10,000 people have died? It was just crazy. And McGoldrick said on my show, hey, I never said that was the upper limit on how many had died. I said that was how many I could prove had been killed in the thing already. But that was a low ball when I said it. And of course, it's been growing year and, month after month and year after year since then. But I think it's quite reasonable to expect that when this is over and they do the excess death rate, that you'll see it's more than 1 million killed. And this is essentially a genocidal war that deliberately is targeting the civilian population to kill them, to starve them to death, to bomb their cholera hospitals when they're dying of cholera. Cholera that they got from their filthy water because we bombed their waterworks. And this is the kind of thing that is absolutely, medieval criminal warfare. And they hide behind, it's the Saudis and the UAE doing it when they're doing it 100% with American support. But I think, maybe the military industrial complex found the perfect algorithm there for outsourcing just enough of a war to make sure that nobody cares and that they can continue and that's not really true. I mean, there are people who care. There are people who've been fighting like hell over this in America, Yemeni American organizations, but also, of course, the Quakers and all different groups, Code Pink and others in Washington, D.C. have been pushing for this. Now that Trump is gone, Rand Paul joined up with Mike Lee, another good Republican on this, and Bernie Sanders in the Senate this week, on Tuesday. They had a vote on a resolution to stop a sale of air-to-air missiles to Saudi Arabia, and it was soundly defeated in the Senate, which is just the shame. I mean, even if you're a senator, you're still only one of 100. You know what I mean? But man, this is the history of the world being written here. And these people are showing up to vote against just what would essentially not end the war, right? Like these air-to-air missiles you could use them to enforce the blockade at the Sana'a airport. But that's not what really is going on. It would be, in the slightest sense, an expression of disapproval by America's legislature that we're over this war and we want you guys to wrap it up now. Here's a vote against what you're doing here, right? Your effort here, in the most minimal sense, and we can't even get that out of them, you know? And then, so why won't the Americans and the Saudis quit? It's because of what Kyle was saying before. They're losing the war. The Houthis, if anything, if the line's moved at all, it's the Houthis moving it. And that, you know, Marib has been outside of their control. It's under the heavy influence of al-Islah, the Muslim Brotherhood faction, and allied with the Saudis this whole time. And so now this whole year, essentially, the Houthis have been making this major effort to take Marib, which would essentially be, I don't want to like predict anything, but it would be such a severe blow to the Saudi war effort that you'd think they might have to call it quits or give up or reassess or some kind of thing. But so that's why they won't quit, because they're in a position of weakness. The Houthis hold all the cards. The Saudis picked this fight and they've achieved absolutely nothing for it. So now what are they going to do? Back down? And then the same thing for the Houthis. They're not racing to the table right now because they're winning. And so, you know, yeah, they lost 15,000 guys, but they're going to win Marib. And so, you know, right when everybody should be stopping this thing, when the whole world should be pulling the needle scratch off the record and call a general strike on the planet, stop spinning until this thing is brought to an immediate end. Instead, it just rolls on. And it's an absolute disgrace. Oh, and then the one more thing, I'm sorry, I meant to wedge in there earlier, was Biden a year ago. No, a year and a half ago, in the spring of 2020, in the campaign, had put out a thing. I guess it was an article he wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations Journal, Foreign Affairs, saying we're going to wrap this thing up. We're going to end the war in Yemen if I win. And then he came in and only, I think 2 weeks in, it was early February, you know, very early after the inauguration, they announced they were suspending all support for Saudi's offensive war inside Yemen. So in other words, they would continue selling of Patriot missiles and any kind of Aegis radar and anti-drone technology, anything to help defend Saudi from attacks by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, they were going to halt all resupply, all maintenance, all intelligence, and all logistics support for the Saudi war effort against Yemen. And then they just did not do that. And it was the very end of April or the beginning of May that Admiral Jack Kirby at the Pentagon, the spokesman for the Pentagon, confirmed that, yes, we are still supplying them maintenance support. And then at that point, that gives away the whole game. Because if that order was an order, then that had all stopped. But if it was just a suggestion, then none of it did. And so now here we are still selling them missiles. Again, they're air-to-air missiles. Not that the Houthis have planes flying anywhere, but it, you know, symbolically is important that we're still arming them up, and that our Senate refused to take the opportunity to express disapproval when obviously Biden would have vetoed it anyway or ignored it anyway and pushed the sale through anyway, if it had come down to it. But I got to tell you, Patrick, I can't think of anything else in the world that's going on that's worse than what America, the American-led coalition, which again includes Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the guys that attacked the Cole, the guys that tried to blow up the plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009, the guys that did the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France and other attacks in Europe. And these guys are real-ass Al-Qaeda guys, not some Al-Qaeda-linked figment of the CIA and ABC News' propaganda, but you know, real ass dangerous Al-Qaeda terrorists. And America is allied with them in a genocidal war that has failed completely for 7 years straight with no end in sight. And there's just nothing else in the world that compares to it. And cry me a river about the mistreatment of the Uyghurs. Not to, you know, poach your speciality there, pal.
Yeah, thanks.
Or look at what's going on in any of the wars in Africa, including the Congo or anything else. I don't know the latest out of there, but, you know, if there's anywhere on earth that compares to the hellhole that is Yemen right now, it would be Congo or maybe Somalia. And in the case of the Congo, America's at least intervening mildly there, if not, you know, in a heavy way, but they're always involved. to some degree. And of course, Somalia is all George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump and Joe Biden's fault, 100%. So, yeah, man, I mean, that's what people need to know is there's nothing more important in the world than this, other than, I guess we're going to talk later about Russia and China and the threat of nuclear Armageddon. But that's still, a potential future. But in terms of what is actually really happening in the world right now, it's an absolute disgrace. It's as bad as anything America has ever done. As bad a disgrace as chattel slavery or the war in Korea or Vietnam or, support for the coup in Guatemala and the right-wing fascists that killed 500,000 people, putting down the insurrection in that civil war, or take the most absolutely ruthless things the American state has ever done, and this is right there with them and right near the top of the list. It's absolutely as bad as Iraq War II. It's as bad as Obama's support for Al-Qaeda in Syria, which led to the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate and all the rest of that nightmare in the last decade. So yeah, give a shit.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to add the UN number, the 377,000. They say that at least half of those are children under 5. And so I'm getting, I'm sure some of those kids probably did die from violence in the war, but that means most of them are dying from deprivation. And, as Scott was saying just before with, other things going on, particularly like in the Africa and in the region, if you look at like Ethiopia, where fighting has broken out there again, and there's the UN saying there's millions of people in need of food, and people are like looting the food stores, and so they're deploying food to certain areas. Or Scott was talking about the Congo, where I believe Ugandan forces actually invaded with the help of the Congolese forces this week to fight additional insurgency against the allied democratic forces there. And so I'm sure that's just going to turn to an absolute train wreck, because the Ugandan forces have been absolutely brutal in the AU mission in Somalia. And, Somalia right across from Yemen is another country that I think is headed in a dangerous stretch. And I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal today that the force that the U.S. had trained up in Somalia, the Puntland Security Force, I believe it's like 600 forces trained by the CIA and Special Operations. Well, they've all returned back to their base and dug in their forces because they're more concerned about, the local political conflicts, among the different governments and fighting factions in Somalia. And they're no longer concerned with ISIS or Al-Shabaab. And I also was wondering when I read that article if maybe that has something to do with the real decrease in Biden's drone strikes right now in Somalia. If our proxy forces are no longer out on the front against Al-Shabaab and ISIS and all huddled up in their base, that could explain at least why they're probably getting a lot less requests to carry out drone strikes in Somalia at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's a real nightmare all over like Africa. And I'm sure that's only going to make things harder for Yemen. I mean, it's, one of the countries that's just hardest to get things into. And so if people are starving to death in Ethiopia too, and it's easier to get food into there, I mean, that could even just drain some more resources away from Yemen. I think they're really having trouble at the UN funding the like couple $1 billion they ask for every year to try to get aid to Yemen. I think they come up short anyway. So,
and listen, one more thing about this. I'm glad you mentioned Ethiopia there, because it reminded me of this really important story that we published earlier this year at antiwar.com by Morgan Hunter. And it's about the locust plague in East Africa this year. It was really bad. And I don't know the excess death rate from that, but it's some. The locust plague was absolutely devastating to the Horn of Africa region. And Morgan Hunter has this great piece at antiwar.com about how, of course, this is all Barack Obama's fault. And this is because of America's war in Yemen had disrupted the program at the university in Sana'a, which was the grasshopper population control program. And the university would go out and eradicate, huge numbers of grasshoppers every year. And they finally figured out what causes the locusts. It's when the grasshopper populations get so large that the mature males' legs rub against each other. They're so crowded that their legs rub against each other. That's what spurs them to turn into locusts. So you got to get to this like critical mass of numbers of grasshoppers before they will turn into locusts. Well, in this case, the war ended the university program that was eradicating the grasshoppers. The grasshoppers got to a critical mass. turned into locusts, and then spread like a cloud across the Red Sea and into the Horn of Africa, devastated crops for some of the poorest people in the world in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and I guess Eritrea and whoever I'm missing right around there. So and I didn't really follow up on all of the latest and the worst aftermath of that. I don't even know that it's all the way over yet. But I do know that it hit them really hard this year. And was it last year, Kyle, that it started and into this year? So
I
that's
think it might start
something
in 2019, but it went on for a while and was a real problem for a huge chunk of Africa. Like you said, almost the whole Horn of Africa had a real problem with the locust.
And so that was famous. But the fact that it was all America's fault for backing this war of treason and genocide in Yemen was not. But it should have been.
Well, and it's difficult too, because you know there's only so much time in the day, and like I was reading enough already, and I was watching your series on YouTube, Scott, trying to explain this conflict in Yemen, and it's just with all the different sides, and it's like the United States kind of like backing different sides and then stabbing the Houthis in the back. It's just so difficult, and it's like, how do we get people to care about this?
Yeah. Well, show them the pictures. Look, I mean, for people listening to this right now, pick up your phone and just type in Yemen children or Yemen babies and put it in your Google Images. And that's not just some fluke, man. I mean, that's what's happening. These children are starving to death. When they say that, it was overestimated, and I hate it when they do this. They said 1 million people had died of cholera, and that just wasn't true. They didn't have the ability to test and prove who all had cholera. So they were sort of overestimating that anybody with diphtheria or anybody with severe diarrhea and vomiting or I guess during a cholera epidemic were being counted as having cholera. So that wasn't really right, but it was still hundreds of thousands of people, and including tens of thousands of people who died of it. And when we say tens of thousands of people, we mean children under 5 years old. And when we say died of it, that means that they were dehydrated to death, that they literally diarrheaed and vomited themselves to death, little 5-year-old and younger, little toddlers and babies. From a disease that you don't even need antibiotics, you just need clean water in a few days to get through it, and you're okay. It's a bacterial infection, but one that apparently human bodies are pretty adapted to fight off if you've got clean water. But they don't. And then when they are in the middle of their epidemic, we bomb their cholera hospital. And you can't make that up. That's true. And, Dave DeCamp, all of our great friend and news editor at antiwar.com, the reason he's our guy now is because of when the Americans and Saudis bombed that UN school bus full of little kids in Sana'a in the summer of, I'm going to say, 18. And Dave DeCamp said, what in the hell is going on over there? An American rocket dropped by the Saudis flying an American plane, killed a school bus full of babies, and 4 and 5 and 6-year-old little babies. So he decided, well, somebody's got to do something about that. And that's why, he joined up with us to do what he's doing now. The thing is, it's an interesting phenomenon in a way. Like if you get George Carlinian about it and get really detached from it and just look at it as like a human phenomenon, like how can you have the Americans committing a Holocaust and they don't even know it?
Right. Yeah.
Right. They're tearing up the entire Geneva Conventions, the entire UN Charter, the entire, War Crimes Act, and the entire international rule of law that they themselves have inflicted on the planet since World War II. And invoked as their authority for this world empire. We're the rules-based liberal world order. It's not an empire at all. We're just here to keep the peace, as Bill Kristol says. But then look at this. What do you call this? It's a massacre, right? It's like if your deputy sheriff doesn't just get away with shooting a black guy, but gets away with kicking in a door and killing every member of the family. I mean, this is not the rule of law. What the hell is this? And this is, dare I say, it's not the American way? Or is it? I mean, I don't know. It depends on who you ask. But I think the American people wouldn't want this if they knew the first thing about it. They would say that this is not right. Why are we doing this? You know, if they knew that, if they could be bothered to learn that such a thing was even happening.
And you kind of touched on this, Scott, but do you think there's any prospects for, this is not a good term, but a natural conclusion? I mean, if Marib is taken, do things kind of die down?
I'll let you take that one, Kyle. I really don't know. I don't have a very good read on Saudi court politics right now, how much pressure they're feeling to wrap this thing up or not, you know?
My guess is no. I mean, it doesn't seem the side, the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council would probably be more into that than the Saudi-backed government, because they are Southern separatists, and that it would seem that at least sensibly it would make sense they'd be happy with the old Southern Yemen with that, but. Every couple of months, they try to break away from the Saudi-backed government, and it doesn't seem to go well for them. So my guess is they don't have the power to do that. Also, Saudi has recently carried out an airstrike in, I think it's pronounced Taiz. It's the third or fourth biggest city in Yemen. If you look at like a map, it's somewhat north of Aden, in between Aden and Hadada. And they haven't bombed that city in a long time. And so maybe the Houthis are taking territory there, or maybe the Saudis are just trying to clear them away. I don't know, but it seems like maybe there's a little bit of a new fight going on there that could be concerning. And then in Hadada, the Houthis recently took and drove the Saudis pretty much out of the city, but then they came back and took a district. And so it doesn't seem like there's really any indication that, Marib would be the end of the fighting or that they would wrap it up. And there's just, kind of so many other issues going on here too. Not only that, but one of the real big factors right now in Yemen is the currency manipulation. The Saudis and their government are dumping currency into Yemen. And so the Houthis, to counter that, stopped accepting any newly printed currency in northern Yemen. And so you have a situation where you have one currency. I'm guessing the notes from 2019 look pretty similar to 2020. And so it must be a hell of a problem to have to deal with on the ground there. But if you look at the exchange rates, the Houthis, by doing this, have really stabilized the inflation, and the exchange rate has stayed somewhat sensible.
They tried to do this a few years ago, and it just hurt their allies, because they're the ones who end up with all the money dumped on them down in Aden and that kind of thing. Whereas the Houthis, as you're saying, take preventive measures.
Right. Well, and then I guess the Saudis figured out a way to circumvent it. They either found some old Houthi notes, or not Houthi notes, but Yemeni, I think Real is what they use. They found either some old ones, or they, according to the Houthis, counterfeited a bunch of old ones and backdated them. But either way, this has caused an even bigger problem, because now the Saudis have been able to dump currency that the Houthis can't prevent from being used. And so there's that. And then there's also this island out in the Gulf of Aden. I think it's pronounced Socotra. Yeah. And the UAE has really taken over there, and they're building military bases there. And it's a really unique biodiversity type of place. They got, if you want to look it up and go through, they cool pictures of trees and stuff like that on that island. But, that's going to be another whole issue, because I don't think the Houthis are willing to give up the Yemeni claim to that island. And, long term that could create a real problem. But I don't think they would ever have the technology to take it back from the Emiratis. I mean, they can't get a boat a couple, feet or miles off the coast.
Well, I think the Marines are there now too, aren't they, Carl?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, I mean, I think when the UAE first took the island, the Marines were right on their heels and started setting up a base there. But I haven't read about that recently. But that was my understanding, was that the U.S. Marine Corps was also staking that island out for themselves.
I know they're building a bunch of
hotels
and stuff there too.
I'm sorry.
Bunch of rich Emirati princes want to go hotels on the island, so they're building that kind of stuff there.
Oh, really? Yeah,
that's a big part of it. Yeah.
There you go. Well, back to the idea that it's going to take American politics. It's going to take, and look, I think people probably could guess anyway that there's no Yemen lobby in America other than just some regular family folk, expats who live here, who have these very small groups. But there's no Yemen oil lobby, no Yemen business lobby of any note. They don't have allies in the Israelis or anybody powerful like that. So it's, and as we're talking about, it seems as though all the incentives are lined up on all sides for the war to just drag on like this, which is just intolerable. So it's got to be up to the American people that, frankly, we would prefer to mind our own business, but we got to make our government mind its own business, and then we can mind our own business, because this is our business. Our government has made this our business. And if we could prioritize this, I mean, what a great thing for the American people to rally around is stopping their government from doing the very worst thing that it's doing. And if you're, a squishy human rights person from the left, then man, is this your issue. And if you're an anti-Al-Qaeda hawk on the right, well, man, do I have a story for you about America on the wrong side of the war on terrorism in the most unforgivable fashion here. So, if you care about what's right and wrong at all, you care about, what it says about America in the history books forevermore, then this is something for us to all work together on and try to champion and try to actually do something about. Because if the Saudis and the UAE and Al-Qaeda and probably the Houthis have their way, they're just going to keep fighting. And not to mention, of course, all the American arms manufacturers. Oh, sorry, one more thing that reminds me. Donald Trump put all these tariffs on China, and that really, caused a lot of disruption in American manufacturing. So then him and his buddy Pete Navarro had a plan. We're going to suck up to American manufacturing by having the Pentagon buy a bunch of stuff from them. And of course, this is just ridiculous thinking anyway, because the companies who were losing out because of the trade restrictions with China, it wasn't the arms manufacturers, that was other companies. But anyway, so there's a great New York Times piece about this, and I'm sorry, I don't know who wrote the thing, but it seemed legit enough. And it was about how Raytheon made this close working relationship with Trump's trade advisor, Pete Navarro. And they said, this is how we're going to keep manufacturing in America happy while we're going through this transition with all these tariffs on China. And what it is we're just going to pay the hell out of Raytheon and Lockheed. And Raytheon, personally, deliberately, explicitly, not just, theoretically like in the cliche, but they actually literally spent millions of dollars to lobby and to try to prevent the war powers resolutions from being passed. And then they worked very closely with Pete Navarro to work with Trump to make sure that Trump vetoed those war powers resolutions passed by the House and the Senate in 2019 to try to force an end to the war. You can't make up that kind of stuff. You could guess. You could say, we all know that Lockheed and Raytheon are behind this because that's how it works and that kind of thing. But yeah, no, here's the quotes from Pete Navarro, and here's the quotes from the Raytheon guys. And here's the quotes from the National Security Council guys. Here's the story as told by the participants. This is the deal that they made to keep the war going for money. For money. And so that's the racket. And that's what it's really all about. And of course, they'll pretend that the Houthis are the cat's paws of Iran or some kind of thing. If that's obviously BS, but even if it was true, well, then maybe you should just make friends with the Ayatollah so that that's not a problem anymore. There's no reason that we got to, ratchet up tensions. It's absolutely the furthest thing from a legitimate casus belli for a just war that, any decent person could possibly support.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that question anyways. This alleged connection between the Houthis and Iran, and you mentioned in enough already how Gareth Porter has kind of dispelled that as well. But that's my other connection. So the other topic I wanted to discuss was this three-front crises that it seems like the Biden administration is facing. You have like escalationism with Iran and Israel beating the war drums. Then you have this whole crisis going on in Ukraine in the last few weeks, heating up from last spring. Then you also have something that I focused a little bit more on, which is the situation with China and Taiwan. And there's always this question, and I think I brought this up before, but is this just one big campaign for the arms manufacturers, or are they just beating the war drums to get close to the line and sell more weapons? Or of course that leads to other dangers like the risk of an accident happening or runaway escalationism, or do they really intend a real kinetic conflict with these three powers? I guess I'll ask Kyle first, and then Scott will get your take.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I guess it's probably a little bit of everything. The money in the corruption is probably, I think, the biggest piece. But I'm sure that, especially the Biden people, they don't want to, they see the world as a chessboard kind of thing, and they're really looking to play their game. And I just think they're a bunch of novices. I mean, we got Antony Blinken running the State Department. Samantha Power is, they're letting her run around in Africa and stir up problems in Ethiopia. They're just, I mean, this is crazy, I think. So a part of it is I just don't think they're very good at doing what they're trying to do and run the world. But I really hope a huge part of it is that they're just out for corruption. And, building up a new thing with Ukraine means that they're going to have to sell more weapons, and the same thing with Taiwan. They're going to make Taiwan a security dependent, just like Israel. They want to start giving Taiwan like $1 billion a year in military aid. That'll never stop and only turn up. And so I think that's like a big part of the game, is they really don't think that Russia or China would push the issue in Ukraine or Taiwan. And so they're just free to build up and put whatever kind of military assets and do whatever they want to do. And then they also get to pretend like they're, still running the world and making it safe for democracy. I mean, Biden has big democracy summit this week, which I don't know if it really did anything because it was all over Zoom, and they just announced a bunch of sanctions. And I mean, hell, even the Pakistanis wouldn't go. But, at the same time, I do think that they look at the world in a way where if, they're preventing Russia and China from having influence in Ukraine and Taiwan, that's defending the way the world is supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, it is the Wolfowitz Doctrine from 1991, the Defense Planning Guidance, or 92, that America will not tolerate any near-peer competitor when it comes to armed force in the world. We'll have, economic competition with powers from time to time. But Germany, Japan, China, Russia, the only real industrial powers in the world that would, could possibly get out of line and challenge American hegemony, they will be kept down. We will keep troops in Germany and Japan forevermore, and we will keep, essentially Cold War pressure continuing on Russia and China to keep them as weak as possible, and to send the message to the world that we will not tolerate any near-peer competitor or, any major power or regional alliance of powers to come together to imagine that they could equal us in military strength. And that way to keep the peace, see? And so the more countries that we include in our alliance system, the more peace we keep. And if we extend our nuclear umbrella to Ukraine and Taiwan, well, that means Russia and China can never mess with them. And if we extend our nuclear umbrella to every country in the entire world, if we bring every country in the entire world into some kind of defense relationship with the United States, then that means that no one can ever fight again. Except that the problem with that, of course, is it only works until it doesn't work anymore. And at the point where it fails, you have something like a border dispute between Ukraine and Russia that could lead to a war between the United States and Russia, even though this is thousands of miles away from our home, even 12 or 1,400 miles east of East Germany, where we used to draw the line back in the days of the Cold War. Now we draw the line all the way right up at Russia's border. And I think Kyle's really onto something when he talks about the ineptitude here. Like, if you watch some stupid Hollywood drama about what they imagine, the White House to be, whether that show The West Wing or, kind of anything along those lines, that that's what Samantha Power thinks too, right? Like that's essentially her conception of power is you get out there and you do what you can, and you don't ever second guess yourself, because that, would be a waste of time. So you just go out there and even if something bad happens, Hillary Clinton, why she would rather be caught trying then caught doing nothing when there was an important challenge to be challenged. And so, it really is that shallow. In other words, it really is that stupid. And you have people who have, Anthony Blinken is another one. People who have no real sense of introspection, no idea of how ridiculous they sound. For example, condemning China for human rights violations while they continue to arm the Saudis, carpet bombing the Yemenis. I have no idea that anybody's pointing and laughing at them at all as, they carry this stuff out and dictate these policies. And then what happens, though, is you get these silver linings where you think, well, somebody up there is an adult. So after what do we have, Kyle? We got 5 weeks straight of chest thumping about Ukraine. And we stand with Ukraine, and our commitment to Ukraine and its sovereignty is ironclad, and we will never back down. And if Russia messes with Ukraine, there will be the severest consequences, and all options are on the table. And then, okay, we're not going to let Ukraine into NATO. And in fact, we're going to pressure them to give more autonomy to the counties in the Far East there, the Donbass region, oblasts, like in the Minsk II deal. We're going to try to force Kiev to live up to Minsk II. So as, to reduce tension in the east of the country there. And, here's the head of the CIA, William Burns, is now saying that actually we're not so sure they're going to attack after all, like we told the Washington Post to tell you 5 weeks ago. And I forgot there was one more thing. Oh, and Biden did a press conference where he was asked, well, would you put troops in Ukraine if Russia attacked? And he goes, no, we would not. Our commitment to NATO is sacred, but Ukraine is not in NATO, right? And that's Biden, the guy who helped do the coup of 2014, talking. At some point, even his senile old brain recognizes that this is just a bridge too far. Niet means niet. And Putin made himself very clear. So what are you going to do? You're really going to arm up Ukraine to such a degree that you provoke a Russian invasion to destroy that equipment, or worse, to take over that country or half of it or more, or what? Or sit down and shut up and let this thing cool off because you don't mean it anyway. You're not going to protect Ukrainian sovereignty if it comes down to it. If we got to lose Denver and Dallas and Washington, D.C. to save Kiev and Odessa, there's no chance, right? So what are we doing? And I think what we have just in the last 2-3 days here, check the top headlines at antiwar.com right now. Last 2-3 days here, we have severe climbing down by the jackasses in charge up there in the White House. Somebody piped up. And so what are we doing? We're painting ourselves into a corner here. And it may have just happened. I don't really know. I'd like to see if there's a supposed, readout or, a sort of pseudo transcript of the phone call. But this might have happened during the phone call. This might have been a matter of Putin saying to Biden that, like, look, man, just so that we understand each other, when I say things, I mean them. Now, I know a lot of times when you guys say things, you don't mean them, and that's okay. But I really mean it when I say to you X, Y, and Z. Do you read me loud and clear? And then Biden back down. Because what's he going to do? Get us all killed? So thank God for that.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wish list there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribe Star button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to Rokfin.com, Rokfin. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute, just a whole bunch of people, Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack /Substack. So you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show.
Now, let's go to Taiwan. Let's get some reason over there. You know, Kyle, I'm sure you saw the, or Patrick, I hope you saw too, running today on the site is Ted Snyder's piece about how the American foreign policy nightmare during the Cold War was that Paris and Berlin would join up with Moscow and Beijing. And this would be, you know, the ultimate nightmare, be the loss of all of Eurasia. And, you know, it's like in 1984, right? Britain is airstrip 1, but the rest of all of Eurasia is under the control of the Reds. And so that was always the nightmare, right? So, well, I guess they did have a Sino-Soviet split in 1984, didn't they? Anyway, so this is the nightmare, and then this is what they're accomplishing, right? They alienate everyone, they threaten everyone, and they end up pushing the Europeans toward the Russians and the Chinese. I don't care, but I'm just saying the Americans, essentially, you know, it's just like in Star Wars, and Princess Leia says, the more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more systems will slip through your fingers. So, that's how it works, right? Just like the cops in your neighborhood. The more they crack down, the more regular, decent people hate them, the harder their job becomes. You know, it's the same kind of thing. And so, you know, I think, and Trump helped with this in a backhanded way, that he made the Europeans realize that, you know what, maybe we just need to go ahead and normalize our relations with Russia more than before. And we need to go ahead and hurry up and get this Nord Stream 2 deal done. And we can't really rely on America. And so, good. You know, that's what I'm saying. Go ahead and push them together. It's not like we're pushing them together in alliance against us, in a military alliance that means harm to us, that's aggressive to us. Certainly, obviously not the Europeans, but not the Russians or the Chinese either. But we're just pushing them together defensively. But so maybe we could just back off. And if you look at all the Chinese advancements in their military over the last generation, it's all in direct response to American provocations. Like, one, it wasn't a direct provocation, but it was, they saw the results of Iraq War I with all the laser guided and satellite guided bombs and all of that. And they said, we got to step up our game. From all that bragging on TV was what done us in there. And then I forget if there was a big step after Clinton bombed their embassy in Belgrade in Serbia in 1999. But certainly after he sailed the Seventh Fleet in the Taiwan Straits in 1997, that they, you know, launched a new kind of era of improving their naval capability. And then in the aftermath of Iraq War II, when, you know, George W. Bush was essentially made that defense planning guidance the official national security strategy of the United States. And they said, you know what, we're going to have to start taking this more seriously. And because, you know, the Americans were starting already to do this, you know, admitted pivot to great power competition. In fact, as I maintain in the latest book, even the Middle East wars were in a sense a continuation of the old Cold War. The major reason to dominate Middle Eastern oil supplies is so we can lord it over our enemies, the Chinese, or our allies and friends, the Indians, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and everybody else that we want to be friends with us. We got to control what Dick Cheney called that all-important choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And so, even all of that, dominating Mesopotamia, other than obviously the Zionist motives involved there, but from the military point of view of strategically dominating those oil resources, was all about China and limiting China. And they were looking forward to that back 30 years ago when China, had 1/100th of the economy that it has now. But they saw that this is a severely energy dependent, foreign energy dependent economy here. And this is how we can control them. So, but yeah, now is it all a racket? Yeah. I mean, look, 30 years ago this month, we're just 2 weeks away from the anniversary. 15 days away from the anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, of the final end and disintegration of the USSR. Red flag came down, red, white, and blue flag went up, and it was gone. Like that, not one member of the Soviet Union stayed commie, right? Like the whole thing was over. And at that point, David Stockman wrote this great piece about this on his Ukraine piece the other day, that H.W. Bush, he was man enough, he would have dismantled the entire military. And he did do a great job, man. He did abolish tens of thousands of nukes, and he did, abolish destroy huge numbers of American bombers and reduce Army division numbers way down and all of these things. But it wasn't enough. And then he went and he did the stupid ass goddamn Iraq War I and got that, permanent expanded footprint in the Middle East. He could have renounced the whole thing. And, I know the Birchers were saying, oh, it's all a trick. And the commies are going to come back. They're just trying to trick us into disarming, and then they're going to come back. But nah, the Red Army had ceased to exist. I mean, Pat Buchanan said that, like, man, go to Eastern Europe. These nations are free. It's over. It is over. And Jean Kirkpatrick, who is a neoconservative, a former Trotskyite turned right-wing Reaganite, member of the Social Democrats USA, and then became Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the UN and was, known as a neoconservative hawk. She wrote this great piece in the National Interest called A Normal Country in a Normal Time, that essentially, now that that's over, we could be a limited constitutional republic. As Pat Buchanan and the paleoconservatives famously said, that the reason we tolerated this totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, as William F. Buckley put it in Commonweal magazine, was because of the emergency, the temporary emergency. That was world communism. But now that that's over, then that's it. We, without question, should abolish NATO immediately and bring every one of our troops home from the entire world immediately. And it's just, if you want to be nice and give them credit, then it's a completely ridiculous, paranoid fantasy that Russia, China, Germany, Japan, or anyone else wants to rise up again and be a global empire and go back to World War and all of this crazy stuff. And that's if you're being charitable. The honest interpretation, frankly, is that it's all just a giant lie to sell weapons. The whole thing is a racket because the generals and the admirals and the shipbuilders and the plane builders don't want to have to get real jobs providing goods and services in the market with market risk and market prices. They want to be on the dole. They got cost plus. No matter what we waste building a plane that'll never fly, you got to pay us that plus our profit margin, deal up front. No backsies. And the whole thing is just a racket. It's just a racket. If you could had a magic wand, Patrick, and you could just go back to the end of the Cold War and then the Pentagon ceases to exist, all the generals are fired, all the infantry got to go get jobs swinging hammers, the whole thing is just over. And somehow there was a force field that prevented the standing army from being reassembled again. Just fine. Just fine. There'd be no problem at all. The world doesn't need a hegemon at all. We wouldn't have China or Russia taking back over a thing either. And, no, it wouldn't be perfect, but you know, and as much as I am not a fan of the UN Charter and the entire post-World War II order as led by the Americans, I think that a certain part of that is, you know, almost self-enforcing without the UN Security Council, just through membership. That essentially after World War II, the nations realized that weapons are just too good now to keep doing this, and that it's just better to keep trade open and to respect each other's sovereignty. I mean, look at all the nations in the world that don't have nukes and who are not part of our nuclear umbrella, but are just, you know, non-aligned and don't even seek nukes to deter their neighbors because they're not worried about their neighbors. They're just trying to be a normal country in a normal time. And that's what we could do. You know, just because we have the ability, which we can't really afford it. I know you guys know enough about economics to know that only in the short term with bubble gum and string can you make it look like we can afford it. We can't really afford it. But even if we could, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And you know, I guess people don't have to agree. I think there is an argument for Bill Kristol's argument in that debate that America, just like it keeps the peace between the states and the Union, that it keeps the peace in Europe with its overweening domination. You could argue that, but you don't really know the counterfactual. It doesn't really seem like the states in the Union or the states of Europe have reason to fight, that our national government is really preventing it all. It's more likely, can't really prove it, more likely this is, you know, Homer Simpson's bear repellent, you know, keeping the bears at bay when there are no bears at all. And that's just the proof of how well it works, you know. And then look at the costs, as we've been talking about. Look at the cost for the people of Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen, and before them, Korea and Vietnam, and all the people dead in the you know, killed in their Condor, you know, liquidation operations by right-wing governments that America supports, et cetera, like that. It's a hell of a price to pay. And yeah, I mean, I think any person of any political persuasion with like any kind of history and knowledge of the history of just the last 30 years could tell you that it didn't have to be this way at all. It should be easy for any of us to imagine that H.W. Bush could have completely dismantled the empire once and for all. And we could have spent the last 30 years at peace and being prosperous and fighting about things that matter much less.
Yeah, if only.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when, you know, I was growing up as a kid when I watched Terminator 2. You have the little boy in there, John Connor, has to ask the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, why Skynet would do this, because the Russians are our friends now. You know what I mean? Because this movie.
That's so funny. I just said that to Dave Smith last night. We were talking about this, and I said, yeah, even in Terminator 2, they had to rewrite the whole program here because I thought we're friends with them now. But no, we blew that. Oh, by the way, if anybody wants to read my take, at least on this, which two really great Russia experts, Lyle Goldstein and Ray McGovern, both said they really liked every word of it. It's called, although Ray didn't like my title, but it's called The New Cold War with Russia is All America's Fault. And it's at antiwar.com. And it's a speech that I gave in February 2020, the day that they signed the Afghan withdrawal deal. And the day that COVID was breaking out in King County there in Seattle, I was up there giving a speech. And essentially, it's just a chronological thing. H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and what all they did in terms of Russia policy to make things the way they are. And nice little debunking of Russiagate in there and a few other things. So that's a bit of the background for people who want to know about how this relationship developed since the end of the Cold War.
How much time do we have yet? Do you guys got to go?
I don't know. I'm okay for a minute. Go ahead.
Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Scott, is, and maybe you addressed this in a more recent show, but I've gone back and forth on this question of whether or not China would take Taiwan. But more specifically, whether it's even feasible, because I read this article, I think in the Diplomat, talking about how heavily defended Taiwan is and how a traditional invasion would be like D-Day times 5 and all these missile emplacements like on the Rocky Coast and that kind of stuff. But then you had this guest, I think he was naval intelligence, former naval intelligence.
Yeah, Lyle Goldstein.
Yeah, it was Lyle Goldstein then. Well,
Same guy, yeah.
He said Taiwan will fall in 48 hours. And so am I stuck in the old paradigm in that?
I really don't know, man. And you know what? I read a piece on, is the best thing I ever read in the New Republic in my life today, that Peter Van Buren had linked to. And it was about how China's not going to attack Taiwan. And a big part of it was because, man, it would be a hell of a fight. And of course, their supply lines, they would have to keep their ships out there as sitting ducks for weeks and weeks and weeks while they accomplish this and all these things. I know that Goldstein is looking at the order of battle, and he's saying, man, the Chinese got us licked, and they got the Taiwanese licked. And I forgot what he said on my show in terms of like the window. I think, he had kind of a somewhere between 72 hours and 3 weeks, or, whatever it was, but it'll be over quick because no one can stop. No one will be able to help them. The Americans would have to stand off from so far away that they wouldn't really be able to do anything at all. And then I think Peter Van Buren makes the case that, that's just not so, that America can bring plenty to bear and the Chinese know it. And that's a big part of why they're not going to do it. They know that there's a significant risk of getting into a tangle with the American nuclear superpower, and they'd rather just wait. And at some point they'll just negotiate re-entry of Taiwan into the Union, and however that works out, and they'll do that. And that there's no reason to change the status quo there at all, especially considering the amount of risk there. And in fact, I should talk to Lyle again, because, when I said to Peter Van Buren this, and he's a State Department official who was stationed over there for a long time and stuff. But, when I said to him all this, he says, well, what indication does Goldstein have that this is going to happen soon? And as I remember it, I think the answer was simply, well, they've been building up their capability to do so. That they're in the position now to be able to, they've been practicing, this kind of thing. Well, in terms of like what's changed politically that would make them want to do this now instead of later or never, there's no obvious answer. And this, the New Republic piece that, first of all, Peter Van Buren's new one is in, he has a couple good ones at the American Conservative, but he's got a new one that we ran today, Kyle, right? At antiwar.com, where he links to the New Republic piece, where, now I forgot what point I was going to make out of there. Yeah, I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought.
Well, if I could just mention something about Van Buren real quick. One of the big arguments that he's been making on this that I really like and I think is pretty convincing is that a lot of people are looking at this as like China versus Taiwan, as you would, I don't know, Russia versus Germany, when, almost everybody is a Han Chinese that you're talking about in either China or Taiwan. And so this is far more of a civil war, and you have to have a real appetite to kill your own people. And, that's something that, Van Buren brings up. I think that's really important that I don't hear almost anybody else comment on, is just how much of a natural willingness among, each population is there to fight each other. And he says it's pretty low. And that's from his time in the region in both countries and everything.
Well, I guess Goldstein would say, though, is that this is like a bloody nose on the face of China. Like they're pissed off because this is personal for them. I guess maybe he's talking in terms of states and you're talking like man to man,
I don't know. I think, I'm mad because I just thought of my point and then I lost it again.
Well, people were saying about the opportunity that China would have the political opportunity. I've heard some people say that this crisis
I know
in
what
Ukraine.
It was. Wait, let me say it so I don't forget it again.
Yeah.
The New Republic piece that Van Buren linked to said that, look, what China is doing with their buildup is they're threatening Taiwan that you better not declare independence. They're not building up an invasion force to invade. They're building up enough of a gun to hold to the Taiwanese head to not change the status quo, which is that everybody agrees that Taiwan is part of China, but that will resolve the issue of chain of command and monopoly on force at someday in the future, hopefully peacefully. And that's been American policy for 50 years, that it's one China. So, you know, since Nixon and Kissinger went over there. So, so that was what they were saying in that New Republic piece, was that that's all China means by any of what they're doing there, is they don't want the Taiwanese to make the drastic step of declaring independence. And now Gareth Porter had this piece, back 6 months ago or something, about the project of dual deterrence. And he names names of this State Department official who had changed the policy. And he used to be like a big promoter of dual deterrence. And then they gave up on that. Dual deterrence meant that the Americans told the Chinese, listen, don't invade, don't attack, don't resolve this with force. We would not like that. But at the same time, and announced to the Chinese, they would tell the Taiwanese, and you pipe down. And so, and then the Taiwanese would say, oh, okay, you know, we're not going to go ahead and get out, stick our neck out, or, you know, climb out on a branch farther than the Americans are willing to hold us up. And so maybe we'll be quiet now. And that what had happened was they stopped telling the Taiwanese to pipe down. And the current Taiwanese leader is a pretty hardcore nationalist. And then supposedly her term is almost up. And when she's gone, the next obvious successor is much more of a hawk than her, with a lot bigger mouth and a hotter head than her too. And so if America, as Gareth was saying, if America doesn't readopt this dual deterrence and let the Taiwanese know that don't you go out on a limb, that they're going to go out on a limb, or they're, you know, much more likely to. And so Biden's posture here, where, you know, it's America and the democracies versus China and the autocracies, just nonsense. But in framing it that way, that, you know, we're eternal enemies now and all of this kind of thing, you know, he does change the stakes of the game a little bit. And probably just like as we've seen with Saudi Arabia, that if we have their back, they'll be willing to act crazy. You know, and as soon as we look like we're withdrawing support, what do? The Saudis, the UAE, they run to start talking with the Ayatollah. When they think that they have a blank check from us, then they'll do whatever they want. They'll send suicide bombers right to Tehran. But if they think we're backing off, then they'll send their diplomats instead.
Same with Ukraine.
And so it's the same kind of thing here, where we should not be making big promises to the Taiwanese. We should be giving them the bare amount that they need. I mean, all other things being equal, the bare amount that they need to defend themselves. They already have, 25 F-16s or whatever it is. We're done. We should not be intervening anymore, propping them up and in an unnatural amount of power relative to mainland China, in a way that, especially, you know, letting them believe that, don't worry, we'll definitely ride to your rescue if you get in a fight, even if you start it, or something like that. That's just crazy. But anything less than that is cowardice and weakness, you know, to the people in Washington, D.C. In fact, you can find this everywhere, but they say, Biden better not back down in Ukraine or else China will invade Taiwan, because that will send the signal that we don't live up to our commitments, and you must commit to everything everywhere or all the dominoes will all fall down. You know, it sounds like a house of cards to me, but.
Yeah, I heard that. I mean, people were making that argument that this is going to be the perfect opportunity for China to invade Taiwan, is if, you know, we get into a fight over, or, you know, Russia's going to invade Ukraine and then China's going to invade Taiwan, or, you know, Zelensky or something's going to be tempted to invade the Donbass and then Russia will respond in kind. And then the window will open for China to take Taiwan. So big deal. You're muted, Scott.
Yeah, you can, if you want to write for the Council on Foreign Relations, they'll pay you to write that in Foreign Affairs, but it's not necessarily right.
Yeah. Anything else, Kyle? It looked like you were going to say something.
I mean, I guess that everybody always talks about what China is doing, but, you know, nobody mentions that the U.S. is selling Taiwan a brand new fleet or upgrading all of their old F-15. So they're selling them new ones or upgrading their old ones. And then also Taiwan has put together a somewhat domestic submarine program. They're going to build 8 submarines that I think could like go down to pretty good depth. It seems mostly like the US and the UK are putting all the parts together for them, but then they're going to build them in Taiwan. And so that, and with all the other military assets the U.S. is putting in the region. We just had, I think, the commander of the 7th Fleet or 5th Fleet or one of these saying that we could have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, talking about putting missile defense in Guam and all this other stuff. The U.S. and Taiwan are, ramping up militarily a lot too, and that's not talked about at all. It's always just put in the context of, oh, look what China is doing, and then in that way it sounds really scary. Oh, China flew 17 or 13 planes today through Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Well, how many sorties did the U.S. fly in the South China Sea in the month of November? It was 94. These things are really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And boy, are they pushing this narrative too. I was interviewed by a guy who I guess had interviewed me about Afghanistan or something like that on a radio show in Chicago. And when we got to China, oh, they're violating Taiwan's airspace. No, they're not, man. It's the air defense identification zone. That's an entirely different thing. And we do it to them all the time. It's hundreds of miles away from their airspace and all these things. But what a catchy little narrative to pick up and repeat. That, did you hear? They're violating their airspace. Things are getting real serious over there. I saw Scott Adams, the quite influential Dilbert cartoonist, saying, "Red alert, man. This means war." But meanwhile, we're talking about planes that are flying 300 miles away from Taiwan. But the narrative is compelling if the details are not,
Right. I mean, and the Dilbert guy is an idiot and a China hawk and everything. But, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is also saying, well, these flights could be a rehearsal for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So,
yep.
Such a joke.
And it's funny because we just lost the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya and everything. Well, I mean, I guess they did destroy the Islamic State, but they built it in the first place, so that doesn't count. And, America's generals, they're pathetic losers. They're absolutely pathetic and embarrassing. Who thinks that we ought to put them in charge of fighting a war with a major power or even coming anywhere near risking one? The same guys, these losers who just, crawled out of Afghanistan with their tail between their legs. You want to put them in a big sea battle in the Pacific? I don't know, man. I don't want them to do anything at all. Not a thing.
Yeah. Well, okay. Last topic then. I just wanted to ask too, is that it seems like I've heard some pundits saying basically that there's been a real pivot in the last few months, especially with this newest heat up over the Ukraine, is that we're getting to the point where we've reached the red lines. We've reached Putin's red lines, and now there's a turn because Russia and China know that they can call our bluff. There was a few months ago, there was that meeting between Xi. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Good.
Well, there was that meeting between Biden and the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. And I mean, it just seemed like they're starting to dictate things to us and that we have to listen. So is that the sense that you're getting, or?
Yeah. Well, like I said before, I mean, about the big climb down in Ukraine, Biden's awareness that Russia and China are closer than ever and that, they can do things for each other to take the pressure off of each other and this kind of thing is probably a part of that. I think, again, recognizing the kind of trouble that they're messing with there and the idea of getting in a war with Russia is bad enough on its own terms. But, look, I think Gareth Porter has this book about Vietnam. It's called The Perils of Dominance. And it's about how America was too strong. And that's why they got into the war in Vietnam, was they knew they were lying to the American people about it, but they knew that they were so much more powerful than the Soviet Union. So then the idea was we could do whatever we want. And then, so good then if there's a disruption in that narrative now. If they realize that actually we can do whatever we want up until a point, and then actually when Vladimir Putin gets mad and stares and says, I mean it, no, that what can you do except take that seriously? That guy doesn't mess around. He doesn't sit here and like engage in cliches and hyperbole. He goes, look, you're our partners. We respect you. We like you a lot. Don't bring Ukraine into your military alliance. We will conquer it first. You read me? I mean, yeah. 10-4, buddy. What do you want me to say? Yes, I read you loud and clear. That's exactly, he said exactly what he meant to say. And so, they're up against, what else do you call it? It's a brick wall, right? There's nothing else that they could do with or without, a burgeoning, relationship with China. And Russia and China do have their own problems too, on their frontier and that kind of thing. But I think, they've done a pretty good job of papering over all of that for the time being to deal with us. But look, the high water mark of American power was 17 years ago, 18 years ago, died bleeding in the sands of Iraq. And all this is downhill now. And look, in terms of near peer competitors, they're not, right? In any real sense. America's the world empire. China and Russia have no pretension to this status, nor ability to project it or replace us, But you have essentially America is an empire falling apart of its own overextension of just, self-inflicted wounds like what they've done in waging the wars in the Middle East and all that. And they're very emotional about it, seeing, the Chinese standing there as we fall apart. But that doesn't mean that China's really rising in any real way, only relative to us because we're, committing suicide. So, they're embarrassed and they're humiliated about it, and they're projecting a lot of their fears onto China, and I guess onto Russia as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know, dude. I don't pal around with these think tank DC types. I don't know what they really believe, but from here, it's pretty clear that everything that the Russians and the Chinese are doing is defensive. You don't have to like it, but the only reason that the Russians intervened in the war in Ukraine is because America had caused a war in Ukraine. The only reason they intervened in the war in Syria is because America had caused a war in Syria. And the only reason the Chinese, as Kyle was saying, they're building up their forces. Yeah, but look at what we're doing to threaten them. And so I think anybody honest about it can say that, like, look, even if you're from here, I'm from here. Our government they're the aggressors. And when they're not lying, they're paranoid, batshit crazy. And the rest of the time, they're lying about the dangers that the American people face out there.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll see a real pivot from here. I don't know. I don't know either, man.
I think the American people are over it. Right wingers can get whipped up against the Chinese enemy, I guess, from time to time. But can you really make it last? After all that we've been through, this is maybe a good place to wrap up, kind of, is like the future of the right. You saw Tucker Carlson came out there and said, what the hell are we doing? And then you had, Republican senators and even Donald Trump himself attacking Biden for his weakness, saying Putin doesn't respect him and doesn't fear him because he's so weak. Donald Trump, the leader of the America Firsters, I guess. But Tucker Carlson and Stephen Bannon and some of the other America Firsters, they're bad on China, but they're good on Russia. And I don't know if Twitter's a very good measure of it, but it seems like quite a few of the leaders of the new right don't want to hear this. And so even where you have, Republican senators threatening nuclear war, you have, new right opinion leaders are saying we shouldn't have anything to do with this. After all we've been through over the last 20 years, you're going to put these guys in charge of border security on the eastern border of Ukraine. Forget it. We should not be doing this. So that's a fight we need to really have on the right. We need to see that the anti-interventionists on the right need to, put their dukes up and get in there and really battle and defeat the old George Bushian, Cheneyite doctrine Republicans of that previous era. I mean, the proof's in the pudding, right? McCain and Romney lost. Trump won. because of the repudiation of W. Bush. I mean, that was the thing that McCain and Romney would not do, and that was why they could not win. And so if the Republicans are going to concede, they have to finally divorce themselves of this. I mean, Ted Cruz came out, oh, Biden's so weak that Putin's walking all over him. I mean, there should have been a riot, right? All Texas Republicans, shut up, Ted Cruz, idiot. That's not the narrative. The narrative is Biden overthrew the government in 2014 and caused this mess, and he ought to gracefully back out now while the getting's good. That's the line. Get out there and say that, dumbass. But, you know, he's got to feel that pressure. He's got to have, he's got all the pressure in D.C. and the CIA and the national security state telling him, this is the line, Ted. Well, he needs the Republicans of Texas to say, no, this is the line, Ted, and you're going to toe it. And but that's up to the masses of people. That's up to the Republican, right-wing, Tea Party, Trump-supporting voters of America. Are they or are they not America first? Do they or do they not reject the Bush doctrine? And so let's see a scrap, man. There's a fight I want to see. I'll even look aside for the non-aggression principle and let the non-interventionists throw the first punch. They hit the neocons square in the nose.
Yeah, well, let's do it. What?
Yeah.
Anything?
Hey, and us libertarians, we're here for you, right wingers. We got your America first right here, man. I got my boy Kyle Anzalone here. He's got everything you guys need.
So, anything else, Kyle? Before we wrap up, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott is right that the Biden administration is like winding down and, you know, de-escalating a little bit in Ukraine. But at the same time, you know, this did happen early in the Biden administration in April. And as Ted Galen Carpenter pointed out in an article recently, the U.S. really was pushing and trying to make Ukraine a NATO member in everything but name and really treat it as a de facto NATO member. And I guess I do have some concern that maybe the Biden administration, that team thinks they could play a cute little game here and buy a little bit more time and continue to give the Ukrainian government more and more weapons until they feel like they could fend off a Russian invasion. And that would be the assessment of the Russians. And then they could go ahead and invite Kiev into NATO. And then, you know, they could figure out what to do with Crimea and the Donbass from there. But, you know, they're talking about giving them, I think, another $300 million in weapons in the coming NDAA. You know, there's congressmen that want to give all the weapons that they were going to give to the Afghans, to the Ukrainians. They're talking about having a U.S. warship in the Black Sea at all times. It's not, you know, even Jade Sullivan was talking about this when people were asking at the press conference after Putin, if after the Putin-Biden call, if, you know, there's going to be more U.S. weapons or troops in Ukraine. And he's like, well, you know, we're always carrying out training missions and we always have a pipeline of weapons going to Ukraine. And so, you know, that's, you know, just because they're backing down a little bit now doesn't mean that this is over. And right. Bradley Delvin pointed out, the American Conservative today, that Biden's statement about not putting troops in Ukraine did have a qualifier. He said that we wouldn't unilaterally do it. And while I don't think that there's...
Well, that's good enough for me. The Germans ain't coming. I know that.
But I mean, that doesn't mean that like the Poles or the Lithuanians won't do it. Right. And that does technically make it multilateral. Right. And you know, I'm not sure what kind of game they're playing, but you know, they might be trying to play a game, and I'm not exactly convinced that they're done with it. But it would be nice if they were serious about not bringing Ukraine into NATO for 10 years and having a real chance to improve some ties with with Russia between now and then, build some arms control agreements or something like that. But
you know, before it was the French and the Germans put their foot down and said, we're not doing this. But I was just reading a thing about how the new foreign minister of Germany is from the Green Party, and she's a total horrible Hillary Clinton hawk, of course, right? She's no, what's her name? The great Jill Stein. Right, she's some horrible Green Party Samantha Power type who, you know, wants to intervene everywhere. So it could be that we can't rely on France and Germany to keep Ukraine out, because they certainly could veto that before and did. They were also the ones who insisted on the Minsk II deal. They came to Merkel and Holland came to D.C. and told Obama, we're going to go and meet Putin and sign a deal, and you're going to be okay with that. And he said, okay, fine. They came to DC to inform him in person that this is happening now. We're going to do this. And then they did. So, but Merkel's gone. Is she gone all the way now, or she's on her way out?
Yep.
She is.
Whatever. Olaf, whatever his last name is now.
Yeah, we're going to have to learn a lot more about him, man.
Right.
I'm way behind.
Yeah, I was thinking too. I mean, does it matter how bad Ukraine's military is? I mean, they can't take the Donbass region. So is a bunch of, coalition forces, NATO forces coming in there, is that really going to make a difference?
I mean, a bunch of Stinger and Javelin missiles would make a hell of a difference.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I suppose it would. I mean,
and drones.
Are they sending them
Turkey.
Stingers yet, or they're just talking about
yet,
maybe sending Stingers?
But they have bought a bunch of drones from Turkey. I do think those are some pretty advanced and capable armed drones.
Well, so
now the Javelins are shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles, but have they sent? Do you know if they sent Stinger anti-aircraft missiles yet?
I don't think they've actually sent them. They just talked about it.
They're talking about that.
Yeah.
So
that would be a huge step up. That's what they gave the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to bring down all those Russian helicopters. So,
I mean, are we talking about Ukraine retaking the Donbass, or are we just talking about Ukraine, defensive op? Because I mean, are those?
Well, I don't think the Russians will let that happen, but they could try it. And I mean, look, which is an important point. We have a peace deal right now. Now the status quo is low-level fighting, and there's still, some violence, but essentially the war is over. And then now we're dumping in a bunch of weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, what does that do other than incentivize Kiev to try again? The whole thing's crazy.
Right. Yeah, it's just insane. Yeah. Well, I'm trying to reason my way through, I mean, it seems like the reality to me, at least from what I've read and watched and listened to, is just that the Ukrainian military is they're sitting in World War I trenches there, having been there for 9 months, a lot of them. I know, Kyle, weren't you talking about how they started a draft, and now they're sending new soldiers there to that Eastern Front? Or
I know they sent a bunch of soldiers. I don't know if it was by draft or not. I assume they have a draft in Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I thought I heard that somewhere, but I don't know. I mean, it just doesn't seem to me like these rockets they're more of a defensive thing, aren't they? I mean, or if
that's how they sell them. I mean, they're anti-tank missiles, but you can shoot them at all kinds of stuff.
I suppose you could. I mean, it just doesn't seem like an offensive that's supported by soldiers with anti-tank missiles. Doesn't seem.
I think, you could hit the Nets hilltop over with them. They're pretty good guided kind of systems too. You know what I mean? So I think that's part of the reason they're so valuable, and they're anti-armor. And so no matter what they're saying, if it's a tank or not, you could take it out with those things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well,
keep your eye on antiwar.com, man.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, any plugs? I guess, people know where to find your work, Scott. You want to plug anything in specifically?
I'm working on the audiobook, man. I'm almost done. I'm nitpicking over it like crazy, getting every little weird Dr. Pepper click in my mouth cut out for you there. So it all sounds nice in your earphones. Nice. But it should be out for Christmas, and it's an audiobook, so it's not like you have to wait on shipping or anything. So I'm trying very hard to get the audiobook done for you. I know it's been almost a year already since the book came out. Can you believe it? Otherwise just the Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and check out the books, Fool's Errand and Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism.
Awesome. Kyle?
Conflicts of interest of this show, and then antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks so much, guys. I really had a good time talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.